The phone buzzed on the counter, a tiny tremor that split the night, and I knew it was not for me. I am Maya Collins, 29, and I used to trust the man brushing his teeth down the hall. Ethan Brooks said, "Leave it, it's work," and the word cracked like ice. Rain threaded the window, and the city hummed like a confession. I turned the screen, and the preview flashed a heart from an unsaved number. Ethan said, "Maya, don't," but my thumb had already opened the message. The text read, "I miss your hands," and my breath fell through the floor. I heard my voice before I felt it. I said, "How long have you been lying to me?" He stared, then reached for the phone like it was a lifeline. Ethan said, "You're overreacting," and the mirror behind him showed a stranger. Heat climbed my chest, and my palm moved faster than my thoughts. The slap landed, and the room stopped breathing. He touched his cheek and anger swam behind his eyes. Ethan said, "It was nothing," and the word "nothing" felt like a clip. I said, "Someone thinks your hands belong to them," and in the silence the rain applauded. The oven clock blinked midnight, and a life blinked out with it. The sound of the slap kept looping in my skull like a cruel ringtone, and the rain would not let the night forget us. Ethan said, "It is a misunderstanding," and the words slid off the counter like spilled soap. I traced the edge of the phone and saw the history I had curated, photos of summers and birthdays stacked like tidy lies. I said, "Who is she?" and my voice surprised me with its steadiness. Ethan's pupils narrowed, as if the question offended the air. He said, "No one you know," and that was worse than a name. The apartment felt unfamiliar, like a stage set built from our receipts. I remembered last week's late night, and the scent that did not belong to us. I said, "You brought her into our hours," and the clock on the oven blinked in agreement. Ethan said, "I never meant to hurt you," and I saw the dent in the word never. The glass fogged with steam from his shower, and the rain scored its soundtrack. My chest held both scream and whisper, and neither rescued me. I said, "You already did," and silence bowed its head. I walked past him because sitting still felt like drowning in syrup. The hallway mirror showed a version of me I did not recognize, a woman learning a language made of cracks. Ethan said, "Can we talk like adults?" and the plea sounded rehearsed. My throat tightened on the memory of the early days, when we shared grocery lists and passwords. I said, "You taught me to trust you," and the mirror tilted like it wanted to look away. A neighbor's music thumped faintly through the wall, cheerful and obscene in its timing. Ethan said, "It started after that fight," and the excuse swung low like a cheap door. I touched the silver frame of our vacation photo, and felt a chill. I said, "You turned a fight into a passport," and the word passport tasted metallic. My phone buzzed again, and the preview hid itself like a shy thief. Ethan said, "Please put it down," and I felt the power shift by inches. The night smelled of wet asphalt and citrus soap, and I realized love could curdle in a single hour. I opened the living room curtains, and the city answered with a smear of light, like it had seen this scene before. Ethan said, "We can fix this," and his voice wore a suit 2 sizes too big. The word we felt counterfeit under my tongue. On the coffee table lay the postcard from Danny Reed, 30, my oldest friend, who once said hard truths like they were bandages. I said, "Danny told me to pay attention," and the lamp threw a thin halo on the card. Ethan said, "Danny never liked me," and there it was, the refuge of the cornered. I paced between couch and window as rain braided the streets. I said, "I liked you enough for both of us," and the sentence left me lighter and lonelier. Ethan's jaw worked like he was grinding down guilt to something swallowable. He said, "It isn't serious," and gravity shifted beneath the room. The city sighed through the glass, and I understood that silence can be a verdict. I said, "It is to me," and the night pressed closer. The text thread was a map, and I followed it with a tremor in my thumb. The unsaved number held a history of midnights and metaphors, each line a small theft. Ethan said, "Please stop reading," and the request arrived too late to matter. A name finally appeared in a casual signature that made my lungs stutter. Lauren. I said, Lauren who? And my mouth tasted of pennies. Ethan blinked, and I saw the calculation sprint behind his eyes. He said, it's complicated, and I felt the floor measure the distance to the ground. I thought of the office party and a laugh that had cut the air like glass. I said, was she there? And the room shivered in my memory. The rain softened as if it had decided to listen. Ethan said, this isn't how I wanted you to find out, and the word wanted scrape. I said, you never wanted me to find out, and the truth stood between us like a locked door. The clock blinked on, patient as a judge, and Act 1 of our ruin faded to black. I sat on the edge of the bed where once we whispered promises, and now silence pressed against my ribs. The sheets smelled of lavender but carried no comfort tonight. I am Maya Collins, 29, and this is where I once believed love lived. I touched the pillow dent where Ethan Brooks, 31, had rested his head for years, and the memory burned like a candle that would not go out. Ethan said, we can talk tomorrow, but the word tomorrow was a thief, stealing the present from me. The rain had slowed, but the clock ticked like a metronome for heartbreak. I remembered the night he said, forever is ours, and I thought forever was a gift, not a weapon. My throat ached with the betrayal of my own memories, and I wanted to crawl out of my skin. I said, you made me believe in safety, and the walls seemed to close tighter. The photos above the headboard watched with frozen smiles. I reached for one, our beach vacation, and the sand in the frame mocked me with its permanence. The night gave me no answers, only the hollow echo of my own voice. The hallway was dim, as I drifted toward the bookshelf like a ghost in my own home. The floor creaked and the sound felt like betrayal too. Ethan said, please don't spiral from the kitchen, but his voice could not reach me through the fog. I traced the spines of books we once chose together, and my hand trembled on the poetry we shared. I remembered how he once said, every love story is a poem. And now I wondered if ours was just an unfinished draft. My reflection in the glass of the framed bookshelf showed swollen eyes that did not belong to the girl who once trusted too easily. I said, you rewrote my story without telling me, and the words broke in my chest like thin ice. Ethan's footsteps echoed closer, hesitant, as if the distance between us were a canyon. The rain had softened into drizzle, but the air inside remained heavy. I turned away from the bookshelf and felt the weight of the house press on my shoulders, every object suddenly an artifact of lies. I dialed Danny Reed, 30, my friend who always spoke with the honesty I feared. His voice cracked through the phone, sleepy but alert the moment he heard mine. Danny said, what's wrong, Maya? And the concern hit harder than Ethan's lies. I sat on the floor by the radiator, cold biting through my spine as I tried to form words. I said, he's been seeing someone, and the silence stretched like elastic ready to snap. Danny breathed sharp, then said, I told you something felt off. The truth was a bruise swelling to the surface. My thumb rubbed raw against the phone's edge, and I wanted to dissolve into the quiet. I said, her name is Lauren, and the word stung like vinegar. Danny said, do not blame yourself, but my heart refused the mercy. The radiator ticked, and the rain finally paused, leaving an unnatural stillness outside. I pressed my forehead to my knees and wished I could crawl back to before the message. The night had changed me, and there was no return. The kitchen table was cluttered with receipts and unopened mail, and I spread them out as if answers might be hiding there. Ethan leaned in the doorway, arms crossed, jaw set like stone. He said, you don't have to do this, but the pile of paper already felt like evidence. I said, every dinner charged for two is a confession, and the words filled the room like smoke. His silence was an admission, and my pulse raced with fury and sorrow braided together. The overhead bulb flickered once and threw the room into strange shadows. I remembered writing grocery lists in this very spot, believing we were a team. I said, you built a stranger inside my home, and the clock ticked too loudly. Ethan said, "It's not what you think," but his eyes betrayed him, darting like guilty arrows. I pushed the papers away, and the slap of paper on wood rang sharp. The house breathed cold, and I realized it no longer belonged to me. I curled into the couch with the blanket we once shared, the fabric still holding faint traces of Ethan's cologne. The cushions felt foreign beneath me. Ethan said, "You should sleep," and his voice cracked like thin glass. I said, "I may never sleep again," and the words were truer than I expected. The television glowed mute in the corner, a silent witness to a war of emotions. I remembered the nights we fell asleep here, laughter spilling until dawn. Now, every memory was a blade. The clock's hands dragged, but the night refused to end. Ethan shifted in the hallway, unable to cross the space to me. His silhouette on the wall was not a man I recognized. I said, "You taught me to love you, and now I have to unlearn it," and the sentence hollowed me. The storm outside had passed, but inside the wreckage remained. My tears blurred the room until all I could see was the outline of a life I no longer trusted. The next morning I stared at the empty coffee cup Ethan had left in the sink, its ring of residue like a scar that would not wash away. I am Maya Collins, 29, and silence had become my new language. The chair he once sat in at breakfast felt like an intruder now. I whispered, "This house is a stage for ghosts," and the sound cracked against the tile. Ethan Brooks, 31, shuffled in with his shirt half-buttoned, eyes heavy from sleeplessness. He said, "Let's not drag this into daylight," and the words hung limp. The light through the blinds sliced us into stripes, dividing him from me. I touched the cold handle of the mug and felt betrayal echo through my fingertips. My chest tightened with the memory of last week when he claimed to be working late, but the receipt from a bar spoke otherwise. I said, "Your lies are stains that never rinse," and he dropped his gaze. The fridge hummed, louder than both of us, and I realized mornings would never taste like coffee again. Later that day, I found myself standing by the phone again, the glow of a missed call from an unknown number pressing against my chest like a bruise. Ethan said, "Don't answer that," and the command twisted my stomach. The silence after his words felt like thunder waiting to fall. I said, "Why does silence frighten you?" and the air thickened. The phone buzzed again, and my hand hovered as though the truth itself begged me to pick up. Ethan's jaw clenched, his breath sharp as if every vibration was a countdown. I thought of the nights he stayed late, and how the word deadline had become another mask. I said, "Every secret has a ringtone," and the phrase hung like smoke. Ethan turned away, pretending to adjust his watch, but his shoulders betrayed him with a shiver. The walls seemed closer than before, wallpaper heavy with memories of dinners eaten in laughter. The screen dimmed, and the call ended, leaving behind a silence that cut deeper than any ringtone could. I followed the trail of his jacket pockets, searching not for comfort, but for truth. The crumpled receipt bore a date and a place I had never been, a bar across town, and 2 glasses ordered. I said, "You never drink whiskey," my voice a thread ready to snap. Ethan Brooks, 31, leaned against the doorway, silence thick as tar. He said, "You're imagining things," and his words wore the costume of denial. The paper trembled in my hands as though it too feared exposure. I remembered his excuse from that night. Late meeting, urgent deadlines, and now I saw the lie stitched into every syllable. My pulse throbbed against the edge of the receipt, my chest carrying both fury and nausea. I said, "This isn't imagination, it's evidence," and the words rang like glass shattering. Ethan's face darkened, lips pressed tight, and the shadows in the room seemed to side with him. The truth now lived on paper, and it screamed louder than either of us. I called Danny Reed, 30, again, my words sharp as knives now. I said, "He's been lying for months," and Danny's sigh carried both pity and rage. He said, "Maya, you already know the answer," and the sentence stung. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, the city below buzzing with lives untouched by my collapse. Ethan stood behind me, silent, a shadow against the lamp. I whispered, "Why didn't I listen sooner?" and the reflection in the glass asked me the same. Danny's voice softened, because you loved him, and the truth slid down my spine like ice. Ethan's silence screamed louder than words, his presence a wall I could not climb. The streets outside glittered with rainlight, mocking me with their normalcy. I said, "Love should not mean blindness," and the glass fogged with my breath. The call ended, leaving me with my own echo, a prisoner inside my heart's cage. The living room held its breath as I finally turned to face Ethan. The storm inside me had grown louder than the rain outside. I said, "Do you even know how many lies you've told?" And the room seemed to tilt. He said, "You're making this worse." And the phrase was an old script rehearsed too many times. My blood surged, the words carving their way out of me. I said, "You built your freedom from my blindness." And his eyes flinched, though his mouth did not. The TV screen reflected us, two fractured versions of people we once were. The blanket on the couch lay abandoned, its folds mocking the warmth we used to share. Ethan's hand twitched as if to reach out, but stopped, hanging between guilt and cowardice. The silence between us now was a chasm. I said, "The truth is louder than you," and the weight of it shook the air. His silence was his answer, and the house knew it too. The unknown number rang again, and my thumb betrayed me with a tap that felt like fate. A woman breathed, then laughed softly, and memory flashed a glassy smile from the office party. "I am Maya Collins, 29, and I knew that laugh." Lauren Hale said, "Ethan asked me not to call," and my ribs locked like a vault. I said, "You texted 'I miss your hands,' and the word scorched." She exhaled, elegant and cruel. Lauren said, "We should talk somewhere public," and my kitchen shrank to a matchbox. The rain had stopped, and the city glittered like broken jewelry. I said, "Say it now," but she offered an address instead. Ethan Brooks, 31, watched me from the hall, color draining, and the walls leaned in to listen. He said, "Hang up," but my spine refused. Lauren said, "North Harbor Cafe, 30 minutes," and the line died with a click that tasted metallic. I stood very still and understood that recognition can be a blade disguised as memory. North Harbor Cafe smelled like burnt sugar and morning damage, and I took the corner booth because corners do not lie. Lauren Hale, 30, female, slid in opposite with a coat that matched her practiced smile. I said, "How long?" and my voice carried no tremor. She stirred her coffee like it held absolution. Lauren said, "Since March," and the month detonated behind my eyes. I remembered the first notice that never reached our mailbox. "Awadi Jasi Wand." I said, "Did you work the building file?" And her lashes answered before her mouth. Lauren said, "I consult for harbor property," and the floor tilted. She said he needed the lease in his name before renewal, and the cup clinked a verdict. I saw the stage texts, the timed fights, the engineered distance like trap springs. I said, "You both planned my exit," and the cafe light went cold. Lauren said, "He said you'd land on your feet," and the kindness curdled. I realized the affair was the cover, and the theft was the point. The door chimed, and a small life stepped in with a violin case and eyes too honest for this room. Ava Miller, 12, female, our neighbor's daughter, spotted me and waved with shy warmth. I said, "Hey Ava," and my voice softened at the edges. Lauren watched the exchange like a judge. Ava said, "Mom said the mailroom lost things again," and the bouquet squeaked against her coat. The sentence ripped a seam in the story. I said, "When?" and she frowned in thought. Ava said, "Since spring," and the word matched March like a key sliding home. Lauren looked away, and guilt made a tiny ripple in her perfect surface. I felt the weight of collateral hurt land on a child who never asked for this. I said, "Practice hard," and she smiled, pure as unbroken glass. The cafe buzzed dim to a hush, and the truth rearranged itself. Ava left and the door chimed again, a metronome for consequence. The grown-ups had built a trap, and the innocent had noticed the bait. I stepped into the alley for air that did not taste like performances and dialed Danny Reed, 30, the person who once stitched me together with blunt kindness. He answered on the second ring. Danny said, "Talk to me," and I let the outline spill. I said, "Lauren works for the property manager," and silence bent the sky. He exhaled a confession he had been holding too long. Danny said, "I saw her last name on a lease email preview." And I hesitated. The word hesitated knocked the breath from me. I said, "You knew a thread," and his voice folded. Danny said, "I suspected and feared breaking you before I was sure." The city hummed like an apology it could not deliver. I saw the spring notices, the vanished mail, the strategic fights, and Ethan's sudden push to handle rent alone. I said, "They wanted me gone before renewal," and the alley narrowed to a tunnel. Danny said, "Maya, I am with you now," and the loyalty soothed like a compress on a burn. I returned home with the new map burning in my hands and found Ethan Brooks, 31, male, folding laundry with the calm of a staged photograph. I said, "You needed me out before the lease," and his shoulders flinched. He set the shirt down as if gentleness could erase design. Ethan said, "You are mistaken," and the lie clattered. I placed the receipt, the call log, and Lauren's confession like evidence on a courtroom table. I said, "You used her job to erase my mail," and the room shrank. He looked at the floor where Arg held the imprint of our old Sundays. Ethan said I panicked, and the word begged for mercy it had not offered me. I said, "You built an exit shaped like me," and silence rang. He reached out, and then withdrew, a man allergic to consequence. The apartment listened, every wall a witness. I said, "This is not just infidelity," and the truth finally stood upright. The confrontation we feared had found its final form. The air in the living room felt wired to a storm that had chosen our names, and I stepped closer to the table, as if the truth needed a witness. "I am Maya Collins, 29, and my voice finally found its bones. I said, "You and Lauren engineered my disappearance from my own life," and the words landed like iron. Ethan Brooks, 31, stared at the papers as though letters could change shape. He said, "It got out of hand," and the phrase begged for sympathy it did not deserve. I remembered March, and the missing notices, and the practice fights that sharpened like knives. I said, "You rehearsed pain to make it look natural," and the room leaned forward to hear. His chest rose too fast, and his hands hovered like birds that had forgotten sky. He said, "I was scared of losing everything," and I almost laughed. I said, "You chose the fastest route to losing me," and the silence answered yes. The city outside blinked a cold approval through the thin curtains. The papers breathed softly, and I stood taller. He tried to reach for gentleness and found only air, and I watched the gesture fall like a broken wing. Ethan said, "I never wanted to hurt you," and the word "wanted" shattered like brittle glass. I said, "You wanted a life without me paying the rent with my trust," and the accusation fit the room. He paced a tight line that our rug had not consented to hold. I saw the arithmetic of his lies, tidy columns leading to a clean exit. He said, "I thought you would leave first," and the confession scratched my skin. I said, "You built a push and called it fate," and the window sighed. His eyes flashed toward the hallway where our framed trips pretended to be proof. I felt the old warmth die with a soft click I could not unhear. He said, "Tell me how to fix this," and the plea arrived without tools. I said, "You fix a spill, not an arson," and his shoulders folded. The room allowed no more disguises, and the clock agreed. The front door clicked and brought in a wind colder than the weather, and Lauren Hale, 30, stepped inside like a verdict that wore perfume. She said, "We should all calm down," and the command made my teeth ache. I said, "You chose a job that steals mail and calls it clerical," and the sentence cut clean. She set her purse down with courtroom care, and her face stayed lacquered. Ethan said, "Lauren, not now," and the panic threaded his vowels. She glanced at him like a partner checking a script. Lauren said, "You told me urgency was necessary," and the room opened its mouth to swallow him. I felt the floor grow solid under my feet for the first time this year. I said, "You both signed your names on my absence," and her eyes thinned. She tried to shrug the guilt off her shoulders, and found it fitted. Ethan's breath went shallow as if air had become accountable. I said, "Look at what you built, and name it," and neither of them did. The argument rose like a siren that no neighbor dared report, and the words finally said what the quiet had been hoarding. Ethan said, "I only asked her to help with timing," and the minimization landed dirty. I said, "You choreographed betrayal to a calendar," and time itself blushed. Lauren's jaw set as if elegance could hold the line. She said, "He told me you were done loving him," and the lie arrived with clean shoes. I said I was busy loving a ghost you designed, and my voice did not shake. Ethan reached for my arm and stopped when my stare cut him back to size. The phone on the table reflected 3 small moons of our faces, each one dimmer than the last. I said, "This is the last time I let you narrate me," and the air found a new temperature. Lauren looked at the door like it owed her a favor. Ethan said, "Please," and I heard the thud of a throne falling. The room exhaled a long, stored breath. The noise burned out and left a crater where our life had stood, and into that quiet I placed the words that would end us. I said, "You will pack tonight and sign the notice tomorrow," and the sentence clicked like a lock. Ethan Brooks, 31, searched my face for the door that used to open. He said, "You cannot mean that," and disbelief trembled like cheap glass. I said, "I mean every line," and the floor steadied. Lauren Hale, 30, looked smaller now, like a costume on the wrong hanger. She said, "This is getting cruel," and I let the charge pass through me into ground. I said, "Cruelty was the blueprint, not the consequence," and the apartment agreed. Ethan's shoulders fell, and the apology he tried to form arrived without a spine. I felt grief move aside for a sterner companion called dignity. I said, "I choose myself," and the clock finally sounded kind. The day outside had not changed, but I had, and there was no unchanging it. Morning came in a hard gray that did not forgive, and the apartment felt like a courtroom that had already ruled. I am Maya Collins, 29, and today the wreckage sends its invoice. Ethan Brooks, 31, stuffed clothes into a duffel as if speed could edit truth. He said, "I will transfer next month's rent," and the promise lay thin as tracing paper. I said, "You will sign the notice at noon," and the sentence clicked like a seal. His eyes searched for a softer version of me and found only the steel he made. Lauren Hale, 30, texted 3 apologies that looked like receipts, and I did not reply. Ethan said, "You will tell people I am not a monster," and the police stumbled. I said, "I will tell them facts," and the room agreed. He lifted the duffel, and the strap bit his shoulder like consequence with teeth. The doorframe seemed taller as he passed beneath it without the crown he wore. The hallway swallowed him and left a silence that fit. After he left, the rooms exhaled and I heard the house learn my name again. I washed the coffee mug until it squeaked, and the sound felt like a reset key. I said, "This place answers to me now," and the note rang true. The window showed a city that moved without asking permission, and I took its lesson. I opened a new bank app and watched my numbers align with my breath. I said, "Autopay ends today," and the calendar obliged. The lavender sheets went into the wash like a quiet exorcism. I laid out a small plan and gave each step a chair to sit in. Ethan texted, "Can we talk later?" and the words slid off the glass. I said, "Email only," and my spine thanked me. The air held no perfume but my own, and even the clock sounded different, as if time had been rehired with better terms. At noon, I met Danny Reed, 30, on a bench that faced the river like a patient listener. He handed me a thermos, and the steam rose like a truce. Danny said, "You did the impossible thing," and the praise landed where courage lives. I said, "I did the necessary thing," and the wind approved. He pulled a folder with tenant rights and resources that looked like lifelines braided. Danny said, "You will not be alone in the paperwork," and my ribs loosened. I remembered how his warnings once sounded harsh, and now felt like flares. I said, "Thank you for holding the mirror," and he nodded without victory. A jogger splashed through a shallow puddle, and the world remembered to move. Danny said, "When grief shifts, it leaves space for skill," and the sentence lodged like a tool. I believed him enough to try. On my way home, I passed the cafe and saw Ava Miller, 12, balancing her violin case like a promise that refuses to drop. She waved with the kind of bravery children wear without knowing. Ava said, "Mom found 2 missing letters under the desk," and the world tilted toward proof. I said thank you for telling me, and her grin brightened the weather. She looked at the violin, and then at me. Ava said, "Grown-ups mess up, but music fixes some parts, and wisdom arrived in small shoes." I said, "Keep playing loud," and she saluted with the bow. The door chimed and carried a note that felt like mercy. In the glass I saw myself not as a victim but as a witness who chose to speak. Ava ran to her lesson, and the street returned to its rhythm with one more kindness recorded. At dusk I stood by the window that once framed my undoing, and let it frame my decision instead. I placed the signed notice, the folder, and a small key on the table like a new architecture. I said, "I choose the version of me that survives," and the room brightened without lights. The phone buzzed with a final text from Ethan that read only, "Sorry," and I felt no draft from it. I typed, "Do not contact me again," and the send arrow felt like an oar stroke. Lauren's name glowed and dimmed, and I let it die unread. I brewed tea that smelled like citrus and clean endings. Danny said, "Proud of you," over a short call, and I believed him for once without protest. Night arrived kinder than the last, and the city's hum sounded like a future setting up chairs. Morning carried a pale gold that did not ask my permission, and I let it touch the places the storm had stained. I am Maya Collins, 29, and the apartment sounded like a library after closing. I brewed coffee without flinching at the empty second cup. The kettle hissed like a patient animal learning trust again. I said, "Today belongs to me," and the words settled on the counter like warm bread. The lease notice lay signed beside my notebook, neat and final. I wrote a list that started with groceries and ended with a promise to breathe. Danny Reed, 30, texted, "Proud still," and the small message felt like a steady hand. I answered with a sun emoji that did not feel like a lie. Outside, the street washed itself in clean traffic noise. I opened the window an inch, and the air did not taste like judgment. I said, "I will be kind to the hours," and the clock agreed with a healthy tick. The quiet no longer frightened me. It only asked for truth. Memory arrived like a film reel that had finally agreed to play at normal speed. I sat on the floor with one box of photographs, and I did not rush. The first image showed Ethan Brooks, 31, with sunlight on his grin. I said, "We were kind once, and the truth did not cut." The next picture held Lauren Hale, 30, distant in a crowd at that office party, a blur I had not named. I felt the old ache rise and pass like a small wave. I said, "I see you now," and the past did not argue. I placed 3 photos in a folder marked Archive, not Alter. I tucked a beach snapshot behind it, letting the frame keep the sand but not my trust. I noticed my hands were steady. The floorboards were warm where the light pooled. A bird outside tapped twice against the sill and flew on. I said, "I am more than what was done to me," and the room believed me. The box grew lighter and the day advanced without drama. By noon I carried a small tote and the key that once felt like a vow. The hallway smelled of lemon cleaner and beginnings. I locked the door, then held the key in my palm a heartbeat longer than needed. I said, "You were a home until you weren't," and the knob felt cool and honest. Downstairs, the super nodded and slid a folder toward me. He said, "Paperwork squared," and relief stepped into my shoes. I walked to the corner where the bus stop wore a new advertisement for second chances. I smiled at the coincidence and let the smile stay. Across the street, the river flashed like cut metal, indifferent and bright. I placed the spare key in a stamped envelope with my name, then mailed it to myself like a ritual of return. I said, "I keep what is mine," and my spine lengthened. The day was clear, and the breeze moved without secrets. I crossed on the walk sign and did not look back. At dusk the sky bruised lavender, and I waited outside the leasing office to collect the final copy. Footsteps approached with a familiar rhythm that used to make me turn. Ethan Brooks, 31, stopped a few yards away, carrying nothing but regret. He said, "I can explain again," and the sentence sagged. I lifted a hand, palm open, not to welcome but to halt. I said, "No more narration," and the wind carried the words cleanly. He stared at the glass door where our reflections stood like strangers at a station. And the city hummed, uninterested in our old script. He said, "I hope someone loves you better," and the kindness stung in a harmless way. I said, "She will," and I meant the woman I was becoming. The office light flicked on, and a clipboard appeared in the doorway like a curtain call. We did not touch. We did not cry. The silence was correct and complete. The manager handed me the countersigned notice, and the paper felt light as a feather that had done its work. I turned to leave and met Lauren Hale, 30, on the threshold, her phone lit like a mask. She said, "I am sorry," and at last the words wore no perfume. I considered the harm shaped like my name. I considered the girl with a violin who kept playing anyway. I said, "I do not need your apology," and the door clicked softly behind me. On the sidewalk, night gathered like velvet without weight. Ethan waited half a block away, hoping for a final rewrite. He took one step and then stopped when he saw my face. I said, "You didn't think I'd ever find out, did you?" And the city took the period. The street light crowned the paper in my hand. I breathed once and the future moved closer. I walked toward it, and it did not flinch.